There is a flower that was never allowed to simply be beautiful. For most of the 19th century, if a man placed it in a woman's hands, he was not offering affection, he was delivering a verdict, and she was expected to understand, without a single word spoken aloud, exactly what he meant. This is the story of Hydrangea macrophylla, a plant so visually generous, so unwilling to commit to one color, that an entire century decided it must be lying, not lying about anything trivial, lying, in the logic of the time, about the one thing a woman was never permitted to be uncertain about, her own heart. Before we go further, this channel exists to hold the knowledge that history preferred to misplace, not to entertain you, to preserve something, if that matters to you. The subscribe button beneath this video is not a request for growth, it is a request for witnesses, because what we are about to open was nearly sealed shut for good, filed away under a single unkind word, and left there for 200 years. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description. That way, you can verify it yourself. Let us open it. The plant's earliest recorded life is not European, and it did not begin in a garden built for courtship. It grows wild across the mountain provinces and coastal slopes of Japan, tolerating shade, fog, and the acidic volcanic soils that most flowering plants cannot survive in. There, it was known by names far older than the clinical Latin the West would later assign it, among them, Ajaci, a word built from older roots meaning something closer to, gathering of indigo, a reference to the dense cluster of small blooms forming one visible mass. The name itself does not describe a single flower, it describes a collective, hundreds of tiny true flowers, clustered so tightly they read to the eye as one shape, one color, one decision, when in truth they are many, all responding individually to the same ground. In Japanese garden tradition, this was never read as instability, it was read as depth, a plant capable of shifting its appearance according to the season, and the soil was not considered dishonest, it was considered attuned, sensitive to its environment in a way few other plants bothered to be. Zen temple gardens in the Kamakura and Kyoto regions incorporated the plant deliberately, using its seasonal drift in color to mark the slow turning of the rainy season, Tsuyu, rather than treating that drift as a flaw to be corrected. There is a second name folded into this history, quieter and more personal, Otakusa. It was given by the German-Dutch physician and naturalist Philipp Franz von Siebold, who lived and worked at Dejima, the small artificial island in Nagasaki Bay that served, for over 2 centuries, as the only point of contact permitted between Japan and the Western world. Siebold arrived in 1823 as a physician attached to the Dutch trading mission, and in the years that followed he built one of the most extensive Western botanical catalogues of Japanese flora ever assembled. Somewhere inside that work, he named this particular plant Otakusa, understood by later botanical historians to be a quiet reference to a Japanese woman he lived with and was legally forbidden to marry under the restrictions governing foreign residents at Dejima. The flower carried her name back across the ocean to European herbaria and nursery catalogues. Almost no one who later received the plant, or the flower cut from it, ever knew that a forbidden life was folded into the word written beneath it. Biologically, the plant performs something almost no other common garden flower manages with the same precision. Its petals, technically not petals at all, but sepals, modified leaves standing in for the true, much smaller flowers clustered at the center, contain a pigment compound called delphinidin. On its own, delphinidin tends toward a fixed shade, but in this plant, the pigment forms a complex with aluminum ions drawn up through the roots from the surrounding soil, and it is that complex, not the pigment alone, which determines the color the eye actually sees. In acidic soil, below a pH of roughly 5, aluminum becomes chemically available and is readily absorbed. The delphinidin aluminum complex forms, and the bloom turns blue. In alkaline soil, aluminum binds to phosphate and becomes locked away, unreachable by the roots no matter how much may exist in the ground. Without it, the same pigment produces pink, sometimes drifting toward a deep, uncertain violet in the narrow band of soils sitting near neutral, where the aluminum is only partly available. The plant is not choosing a mood, it is not performing indecision, it is reporting a precise chemical fact about the earth it happens to be rooted in, translated involuntarily into color, without asking permission from whoever happens to be holding it. This is, biologically, closer to instrumentation than to ornament. Few flowering plants convert soil chemistry into a visible signal this directly, this consistently, or this publicly. That distinction did not survive translation into 19th century Europe. By the 1830s, the language of flowers, or floriography, had become a formal, quietly codified communication system, a way for a heavily repressed society to speak about desire, refusal, jealousy, apology, and warning without ever committing a single incriminating word to paper. Dictionaries were compiled and printed for exactly this purpose. Charlotte de la Tour's Le Langage des Fleurs, published in France in 1819, is often credited as the origin text of the genre. Frederick Schoberl's English edition, The Language of Flowers, printed in London in 1834, carried the system across the Channel and helped fix specific meanings into polite English memory, meanings that etiquette manuals and latest periodicals would repeat, largely unchanged, for the rest of the century. The authors and botanists who compiled these guides were rarely acting out of cruelty for its own sake. They were constructing something closer to a legal code for emotion, a system that had to be rigid and unambiguous in order to function at all. In a society where a single misread gesture could end an engagement or ruin a reputation beyond repair. And inside that code, the hydrangea's chemistry, its refusal to settle into one fixed, ownable color, was recorded not as biology, but as character. Dictionary after dictionary assigned it the same narrow handful of meanings: heartlessness, boastfulness, frigidity. In some regional variants, a woman was said to be asking forgiveness by giving one, though the more widely repeated meaning across English and American floriography guides remained a colder one. A plant that told the truth about the soil beneath it was mistaken, again and again, for a person who could not be trusted to feel one thing and mean it consistently. To hand someone this flower, then, was rarely a gesture of simple admiration. It was closer to a documented accusation, delivered in total silence, deniable the moment it was questioned, and devastating the moment it was understood. Etiquette manuals and advice columns of the period repeatedly cautioned young men against gifting it during courtship at all, not because the plant was rare or difficult to obtain, since by the mid-19th century it had become common in English and American gardens, but because its assigned meaning carried too much risk to leave lying on a hallway table where it might be misread by the wrong relative. This is how erasure tends to work, rarely through outright destruction, almost always through inconvenience. A plant that changes its answer depending on unseen conditions cannot be trusted by a social system built entirely on fixed, ownable, repeatable meanings, so it remained in gardens, admired from a respectable distance, folded into landscape design and greenhouse collections belonging to those wealthy enough to display it as a curiosity, but rarely again handed from one hand to another without a second, more careful thought behind it. Modern soil science has since confirmed exactly what 19th century Europe refused, or simply lacked the chemistry, to read correctly. The aluminum uptake mechanism governing bloom color is now deliberately manipulated by horticulturists worldwide, who lower soil pH with sulfur amendments to produce blue blooms, or raise it with lime to produce pink, treating the plant's chemistry as a controllable and entirely reliable signal rather than a temperamental one. Contemporary plant physiology research on delphinidin aluminum complexation has mapped the mechanism at a molecular level, confirming that the color shift is neither random nor emotional in any sense a Victorian reader might have recognized. It is precise, repeatable, and entirely a function of the ground. The plant was never inconsistent. It was always exact. It simply told a kind of truth that 19th century emotional taxonomy had no category prepared to receive. There is a quieter trauma folded into this history, one rarely spoken about directly. Even now, for generations of women raised inside floriography's rules, receiving certain flowers was not sentiment. It was closer to surveillance conducted in the language of courtship. A single bouquet, correctly read by the right person, could end an engagement without a single accusation ever being spoken aloud where it could later be denied or disputed. Some of that inherited fluency did not survive being passed down through the 20th century. It was, for many families, simply too painful, or too embarrassing, to repeat to daughters who were growing up in a world where such coded cruelty was starting to seem faintly absurd. The vocabulary faded. The silence around why it faded became its own kind of inheritance. Today, in a world where agricultural soils are degrading at a documented and accelerating rate, and where shifting rainfall and temperature patterns are rewriting what can reliably grow where, the hydrangea's underlying ability to read its immediate environment and respond to it with total honesty is no longer a social liability to be managed. It has become something closer to a working model, a living, visible register of exactly what is happening in the ground beneath it, offered up freely at a moment when most modern agricultural systems still largely prefer not to look too closely at their own soil chemistry until the harvest has already failed. The flower was never lying. It never asked to be believed, or disbelieved. It only asked, quietly and without complaint, to be read correctly. For nearly 200 years, almost no one did. Nature does not require permission to persist. It only waits, patiently, for someone willing to look at the soil itself, rather than at the story they were once told about it. If this is the kind of history you want kept rather than repeated wrong, Ancient Food Files * stays open with your subscription.